June 19, 1944. The sun rises over the Pacific Ocean, but something is different about this morning. Nearly 400 Japanese fighter planes are about to take off on what they don't know will be their final mission. By the end of this day, the legendary Zero fighter that once terrorized Pearl Harbor will be nothing but burning wreckage scattered across the ocean floor. But here's what makes this story incredible. The Americans didn't just win this battle. They achieved something that military historians still call impossible today. Stay with me because I'm going to reveal the shocking kill ratio that ended this battle, and trust me, when you hear those numbers, you'll understand why this single day changed the entire course of World War II. But to understand how we got to this moment, we need to go back to the beginning. What? Back to when the Japanese Zero was the undisputed king of the skies, and American pilots faced a nightmare that seemed impossible to defeat. Let me take you back to December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, the morning that changed everything. American pilots had never seen anything like the Japanese Zero before. This wasn't just another fighter plane, it was a flying nightmare. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was designed by Jiro Horikoshi, a brilliant engineer who created what many consider the most maneuverable fighter aircraft ever built. The Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outmaneuver every single aircraft America had. It was so agile that American pilots described fighting it like trying to catch smoke with their bare hands. With a top speed of 350 miles per hour and a range that could take it 1,200 miles from its base, the Zero had capabilities that seemed almost supernatural to Allied forces. But the Zero's deadliest weapon wasn't its speed or agility. It was psychological. When American pilots saw that distinctive silhouette with the rising sun painted on its wings, fear crept into their hearts before the first shot was fired. The Japanese had built more than just a fighter plane, they had created a weapon of terror. Imagine being a 19-year-old American pilot, fresh out of training school, climbing into your chunky Wildcat fighter. You've got maybe 60 hours of flight time under your belt. Your Wildcat is slower, heavier, and less maneuverable than anything you're about to face. Suddenly, you spot that dreaded silhouette approaching. Your heart starts pounding because everyone knows the rule. You don't dogfight a Zero and live to tell about it. The statistics from those early encounters were devastating. American pilots were dying at alarming rates. The Zero had no armor, no bulletproof fuel tanks, nothing to weigh it down. It was built for one thing, pure aerial combat superiority. And for the first 2 years of the war, it dominated the Pacific skies like an apex predator stalking helpless prey. At Wake Island, the Philippines, Coral Sea, and countless other battles, the Zero carved through American formations with surgical precision. Experienced pilots who had trained for years were shot down in minutes. Rookies lasted seconds. The psychological impact was crushing. American aviators began to believe the Zero was simply unbeatable. Lieutenant David Harrington was one of those early pilots who faced the Zero in a Wildcat. Years later, he would describe those encounters as flying coffins against ghosts. Every mission felt like suicide. Every engagement with the Zero was a reminder that America's aircraft were relics of a bygone era, completely outclassed by Japanese engineering and pilot skill. But something was happening back in America that the Japanese couldn't see coming. In factories across the United States, engineers were studying every combat report, every desperate radio transmission from pilots who had faced the Zero and somehow survived. They were analyzing gun camera footage, interviewing survivors, and slowly piecing together the Zero's strengths and weaknesses. The engineers at Grumman Aircraft Corporation, led by Chief Designer Leroy Grumman, realized something crucial. They couldn't beat the Zero at its own game. Trying to build a more maneuverable fighter would be like trying to outswim a shark. Instead, they needed to change the rules of aerial combat entirely. Enter the F6F Hellcat. Now this wasn't just an improved fighter. This was America's complete philosophical answer to Japanese air superiority. Where the Zero was light and fragile, the Hellcat was armored like a flying fortress. The cockpit was surrounded by bulletproof steel plates. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, preventing the fiery deaths that had claimed so many Wildcat pilots. But the Hellcat's real killing power came from its armament. 650 caliber Browning machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. When a Hellcat opened fire, it unleashed a stream of lead so dense it could saw a Zero in half. The firepower was devastating. Where a Zero pilot had to score precise hits to bring down an enemy, a Hellcat pilot just had to point and squeeze the trigger. The heart of the Hellcat was its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, producing 2,000 horsepower. This gave the Hellcat something the Zero couldn't match: raw speed and climbing power. American engineers realized they couldn't outturn the Zero, so they built a fighter that didn't need to. Here's the genius part. American pilots developed new tactics called boom and zoom. Instead of trying to dogfight with the agile Zero, Hellcat pilots would dive down from high altitude, unleash devastating firepower, then climb back up to safety using their superior speed and power. It was like a hawk hunting mice: strike fast, strike hard, then retreat to strike again. But the real game changer wasn't just the aircraft. It was something the Japanese never saw coming. And I'll reveal the secret weapon that made American pilots nearly unbeatable by 1944. While Japan was struggling with fuel shortages and losing experienced instructors in combat, America was building the most comprehensive pilot training program in history. American flight schools were turning out pilots with over 300 hours of training before they ever saw combat. They practiced gunnery until they could hit targets blindfolded. They flew formation drills until moving as a coordinated unit became pure instinct. The contrast was staggering. By 1944, Japanese pilots were going into combat with less than 50 hours of flight time. Some had never even flown over open ocean before their first combat mission. Many couldn't perform basic maneuvers under stress. They were brave, but bravery alone couldn't overcome such a massive training deficit. Meanwhile, American pilots were learning advanced tactics like coordinated attacks, mutual support, and energy management. They studied the Zero's weaknesses: its lack of armor, its tendency to explode when hit in the fuel tanks, its inability to dive at high speeds without losing control. The industrial numbers were even more overwhelming. While Japan was struggling to replace even a dozen aircraft each month, American factories were producing thousands. Think about this. By 1944, the United States was building more aircraft in a single week than Japan could produce in 3 months. The Ford Motor Company alone was producing more military equipment than the entire Japanese aircraft industry. But it wasn't just about quantity, it was about quality control and consistency. American factories were turning out aircraft that performed identically with standardized parts and reliable engines. Japanese aircraft production, hampered by material shortages and bombing raids, was becoming increasingly inconsistent and desperate. This brings us to 1944 and the strategic situation that would lead to the greatest aerial slaughter in history. The Mariana Islands, tiny dots of land in the middle of the Pacific that both sides knew would determine the entire war. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were more than just islands. They were the keys to victory itself. If America captured these islands, they could base B-29 Superfortress bombers there, putting every major Japanese city within range of devastating air raids. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, all would be vulnerable to round-the-clock bombing that could bring Japan to its knees without invasion. If Japan held the Marianas, they could continue the war indefinitely, forcing America into a bloody island-hopping campaign that could last years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. For the Japanese High Command, losing the Marianas meant losing the war. For America, capturing them meant victory was in sight. Admiral Saburo Sakai, commanding the Japanese fleet, knew this was Japan's absolute last chance. He gathered every remaining aircraft carrier in the Imperial Navy, scrounged up 400 planes from across the rapidly shrinking empire, and prepared for what he called the decisive battle. This was it. Everything Japan had left would be thrown into one massive, desperate gamble. But Ozawa's force was a shadow of the mighty fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor. Many of his aircraft were obsolete. His pilots were mostly inexperienced boys, some so green they had trouble finding their own carriers after takeoff. His ships were running low on fuel and ammunition. It was a force held together by pride, desperation, and fading hope. On the American side, Task Force 58 was the largest and most powerful naval armada ever assembled in human history. Under the command of Admiral Raymond Spruance and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, it was a floating fortress of unprecedented destructive power. The numbers alone were staggering: 15 fast aircraft carriers carrying nearly 1,000 planes, 7 battleships, each one capable of leveling coastal cities, 8 heavy cruisers bristling with radar-guided guns, dozens of destroyers providing anti-submarine protection. But more importantly, they had something the Japanese had lost: experienced crews, reliable equipment, and unlimited supplies. The American pilots aboard these carriers were a new breed of warrior. They had been forged in the crucible of 2 years of Pacific combat. They knew the Zero's tricks, respected its agility, but no longer feared it. With Hellcats at their command and overwhelming numbers on their side, they felt a quiet confidence that this battle would be different from all the desperate encounters of 1942. The night before the battle, Lieutenant Commander David Harrington walked the deck of the USS Independence, running his hand along his Hellcat's wing, the same David Harrington who had flown hopeless missions in Wildcats against seemingly invincible Zeros. Now, just 2 years later, everything was different. His aircraft was superior, his training was comprehensive, and his support was overwhelming. Around him, other pilots prepared in their own ways. Some wrote letters home, knowing this might be their last night on Earth. Others cleaned their guns obsessively, checking and rechecking every mechanism. A few played cards, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't particularly funny, using humor to mask their nerves. Lieutenant Samuel Ortiz, Harrington's 21-year-old wingman, leaned against the ship's railing, staring out at the dark ocean where Japanese carriers were rumored to be lurking. "Think they'll really come at us with everything?" he asked. Harrington nodded grimly. "They have to. This is their last shot, and they know it." Below deck in the Combat Information Center, radar operators watched their screens with intense concentration. Intelligence reports suggested the Japanese were preparing the largest aerial attack of the entire Pacific War, possibly 400 aircraft in coordinated waves. It would be a battle that would determine not just the fate of the Marianas, but the future of the entire war. What I'm about to tell you next is the moment that broke the myth of Japanese air superiority forever, and the numbers from this engagement are so one-sided that military experts still study this battle today to understand how it was even possible. June 19, 1944. Dawn. The sun painted the Pacific horizon in brilliant orange as Task Force 58 prepared for battle. On carrier decks across the fleet, the morning routine began with mechanical precision. Deck crews moved Hellcats into position, checking fuel lines, loading ammunition belts, and performing final inspections on the aircraft that would soon decide the fate of nations. The call rang out across every carrier: "Pilots, man your planes!" Harrington climbed into his Hellcat's cockpit, running through the pre-flight checklist he had memorized so thoroughly it had become pure instinct. Engine temperature normal. Fuel tanks full, 650 caliber guns loaded and ready, radio functioning perfectly. The catapult officer's hand shot up, then dropped like a hammer. One by one, Hellcats were hurled into the morning sky, their engines roaring with power as they climbed toward their patrol altitudes. Within minutes, nearly 200 American fighters were airborne, spread across the sky in a defensive net that stretched for hundreds of miles. At 8:30 a.m., the first radar contact appeared on the screens. Multiple aircraft bearing west, range 150 miles, estimated strength 80 plus. The words that came through every radio in Task Force 58 were simple but electric. "Many bogies approaching from the west. All fighters intercept." Repeat, "All fighters intercept." What happened next was like watching a perfectly choreographed dance of destruction. American Hellcats, guided by radar controllers, climbed high above the incoming Japanese formation. They had altitude, they had speed, and they had the element of surprise. The Zero pilots, flying in loose formations with inexperienced wingmen, never saw the attack coming. Harrington spotted the Japanese formation first, a ragged collection of Zeros, dive bombers, and torpedo planes spread across several miles of sky. Many of the Japanese pilots were flying so poorly they could barely maintain formation. Some were weaving back and forth uncertainly, clearly lost and confused. These weren't the elite pilots of Pearl Harbor. These were boys thrust into combat with minimal training and obsolete tactics. The first attack was devastating. American Hellcats dove down like hawks striking prey, their 6 machine guns erupting in synchronized fury. Zeros that had once seemed invincible were falling out of the sky like burning leaves. Japanese dive bombers, slow and vulnerable, were torn apart before they could even begin their attack runs. Torpedo planes, lumbering forward at barely 200 miles per hour, became sitting ducks for the much faster American fighters. Harrington lined up behind a Zero, squeezed his trigger, and watched as his tracers tore through the lightweight Japanese fighter. The Zero exploded in a ball of orange flame, its pilot's body tumbling through the air like a broken doll. "Splash 1-0, Harrington called over the radio, already banking away to find his next target. All around him, the same scene played out dozens of times. American pilots, many of whom had never seen combat before, were shooting down experienced Japanese aviators with shocking ease. The Hellcat's armor protected them from return fire. The Hellcat's firepower destroyed enemies with single bursts. The Hellcat's speed allowed them to attack and escape before the more maneuverable Zeros could respond. But Japan kept coming. Wave after wave of aircraft appeared on the horizon. 120 planes in the second attack, 80 in the third, 50 in the fourth. Each time, the result was the same. American Hellcats, now working in perfectly coordinated teams, systematically destroyed everything Japan could throw at them. The ocean below became a graveyard of twisted metal and burning fuel. Oil slicks stretched for miles in every direction, littered with the debris of destroyed aircraft and the bodies of Japanese airmen who would never see home again. The water was so thick with wreckage that rescue ships had difficulty navigating between the floating pieces of shattered dreams. Lieutenant Ortiz, flying as Harrington's wingsman, shot down 3 Japanese aircraft in his first combat mission. His radio calls were breathless with adrenaline and disbelief. "Skipper, this is incredible. They're falling apart before we even get close." Harrington's reply was grimmer. He understood what they were witnessing, not just a battle, but the complete destruction of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. By 2 p.m., it was over. The silence was eerie after hours of roaring engines, rattling machine guns, and exploding aircraft. American pilots flying back to their carriers couldn't believe what they had witnessed. They had just participated in the most one-sided aerial battle in military history. The final numbers from this battle are so shocking that when I tell you the exact kill ratio, you'll understand why American pilots gave this engagement a nickname that perfectly captured the complete one-sided nature of what they had just witnessed. Here are the numbers that changed World War II forever. Japan lost 395 aircraft, nearly their entire remaining carrier air force. America lost exactly 29 planes, most of them to operational accidents rather than enemy action. That's a kill ratio of more than 13-1, a level of dominance that military historians still consider almost impossible to achieve. But the aircraft losses were only part of the catastrophe. Japan also lost most of their remaining experienced pilots, men who represented years of training and irreplaceable combat knowledge. These weren't just statistics, they were the last link to the elite aviators who had dominated the early years of the Pacific War. The American pilots, with typical gallows humor, nicknamed the battle the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot because shooting down Japanese planes had become as easy as hunting turkeys on a farm. The comparison was crude but accurate. What they had witnessed wasn't really a battle between equals, but a massacre of the weak by the strong. Admiral Ozawa's surviving carriers limped back to Japan with empty flight decks and shattered dreams. The Japanese Navy would never again be able to launch a major carrier operation. The path to Japan's home islands was now wide open, and American B-29s would soon be raining destruction on Japanese cities with impunity. The Battle of the Philippine Sea proved something that military strategists had been debating for years, that wars in the modern era aren't won by individual heroism or superior tactics alone, but by industrial capacity, technological advancement, and systematic training programs. America had turned warfare into a science, while Japan was still fighting with the passion and traditions of an earlier age. When the smoke cleared on June 19, 1944, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted permanently and irreversibly. The age of the Zero was over. The age of American air superiority had begun, and the road to Tokyo, once seemingly impossible to travel, was now wide open. That's how a single day of combat changed the course of history, turning Japan's greatest strength into scattered wreckage on the ocean floor, and proving that sometimes the hunter really does become the hunt. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot wasn't just a battle. It was the moment when America's industrial might and systematic approach to warfare finally overcame the last vestiges of Japanese naval power, setting the stage for the final conquest of the Pacific. Every story of the past carries voices that must never be forgotten. If this video moved you, please like and subscribe to Past Oracle. Together, we'll keep history's hidden truths alive.